A very good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us at today's virtual event. Now, we're here to share some exciting and cutting-edge research with you and also debate some of these new concepts with you. Joining us today, we have experts and thought leaders on the hot topics of behavioral science and finance, as well as financial advice and investment planning. Now, they'll be introduced to you as we progress throughout this morning's program. My name is Gugulethu Mfupi, and I have the pleasure of being your host and moderator for this morning's event. Now, as many of us have become accustomed to in the last year, working in a virtual world, it doesn't limit us from interacting and having an opportunity to share some questions and engage. And that's exactly what we'd like to invite you to do today. So please do post your questions along the way in terms of the chat box that we have present. Do alert us as to who you are and the organization that you're representing. And most importantly, the person that you are addressing your question to within the chat service. What we'll do is after the panel discussion we'll host this morning, we'll have an opportunity to address these questions with our panel members and share some responses. Now, I'm well aware that some of you are my colleagues in the media and always looking for your own interesting angles and nuances to best serve the audience that you're speaking to. So there will be an opportunity for you to address and have a one-on-one interview with one of the spokespeople that we have here present this morning. For you to do that, please contact Huizimang or Melissa from MSL, and they'll be able to assist you with any media interviews that you'd like to have be arranged today. Most importantly, we also want to strongly encourage you to share the messaging and conversation today with us on social media. You can do that by following Momentum Investments on LinkedIn at Momentum Investments and on Twitter at MomentumINV_Z, ZA rather, and that's for all your posts that you can share during today's conversation. Now, what we'll do over the next 2 hours is really prepare to have our minds blown away by some of the phenomenal research and insight that will be shared with us. We'll find out why the words, "this time it's different," might be four of the most dangerous words within the world of investing, and why the old adage that justice depends on what the judge ate for breakfast is not too far from the truth. Now, until recently, or as recently as a few years ago, behavioral science was barely a buzzword, appearing mainly in TED Talks and a few best-selling books. But things, as we know, have changed. And fundamentally, behavioral science is a way to better understand normal everyday people, be they customers, employees, partners, and the people that we want to interact with and influence. All of them are, wow, people. And Momentum Investments are making this practical through applied research that uncovers crucial behavioral insights of South Africans. Now, they want to understand the influence both advisors and clients to make better financial decisions for better lives and outcomes. And today, we'll be approaching this by exploring both investor and advisor behavior, each through a very different lens and perspective. Now, the first provides evidence of why understanding investor behavior and trying to change it is so important. If we look back on 2020, I think for all of us, we know very well what kind of a tumultuous year it's been. And in 2020, Momentum Investments published a white paper that showed 5 investor archetypes or behavior patterns, and we're going to take a closer look at how these South African investors fared in coping with the global pandemic in 2020 as the markets crashed last year in March. Now, unfortunately, the short answer to that is not very well. So what influences our behavior? Why do we see such a shortfall in terms of the discipline that needs to be exercised when it comes to keeping with our investment objectives? And most importantly, what do we need to be more cognizant of as we move forward in this world of understanding behavioral finance? Well, we'll delve into this first segment of the conversation a little bit deeper with Paul Nixon. He's the head of behavioral finance for Momentum Investments. Now, Paul established an applied behavioral finance function for the business after completing an MBA with distinction at Edinburgh Business School in 2017. Now, he's currently completing a master's degree on South African investor risk behavior at Stellenbosch University, and is also a registered member of the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists. To help us understand a lot more about how investors performed and behaved during the current pandemic, Paul Nixon, the head of behavioral finance from Momentum Investments, joins us now. Paul, we're quite excited but also anxious to hear how investors behaved. Looking at the top line figures and the numbers, I understand we might be a bit of a nation that likes pressing the panic button too often.
Absolutely, Guga. Let's have a look at those results for about 10 minutes or so.
Sure.
So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session. It's really good to be with you this morning. The short answer, really, to this question of, the four most dangerous words of investing, which of course was quoted by Sir John Templeton. The short answer is that this time wasn't actually that different after all. Investors behaved in much the same kind of panicked way that we've seen investors behave, so many times before. And the real difference with the COVID-19 market crash was that investors actually destroyed just a lot more value. And the reason they destroyed a lot more value was because markets recovered so quickly. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on through this presentation. So, all right, to start with, I think maybe to be fair to investors, excuse me, was 2020 that different after all? Well, it certainly looked a little bit different, right? So we saw these reports coming through from the media, these really crazy situations and pictures of knife fights and scuffles in shopping centers around, for toilet paper, which is really quite crazy. We saw in North Carolina there was an abandoned warehouse where they found 10 tons of stolen toilet paper. And in China, for example, there were reports coming through as well of people being hijacked, trucks forced off the road for, again, for toilet paper. So we certainly got a glimpse into almost a little bit of a post-apocalyptic world. So 2020 looked a little bit different, but as far as market crashes go, it really wasn't. So I think we'll start off with having a look a little bit more about what's going on between our ears when we experience these kinds of events. And the short answer to that question really is that when we to start some interesting research, as it turns out, our risk preferences, or our genome rather, has revealed some very interesting information about our risk preferences. So these kind of things are actually genetic in nature. So according to the New Scientist, there was research published where 106,000 people where their genome was sequenced, and there were 9 distinct areas of the genome that were related to risk behavior. So how people behave in risky situations. And this is really quite a key insight because it actually gives us a window in terms of our personalities and our genes and how we actually interpret risk. So these areas in the genome were sequenced and linked to a personality trait called neuroticism, which is linked to anxiety, right? And obviously, when we experience market crashes, anxiety is really going to come to the fore. Now, anxiety basically is just people who are anxious, for example, react to more situations as a threat, for example, right? So if you're going to interpret COVID-19 as a threat to your financial security, you're going to react with anxiety. And really, that's kind of a key part. So if you look at the information on your screen, you can see here that, so just some detail in terms of the circuitry of how we make decisions. And what happens is when your amygdala is going to react to your amygdala is going to send the flight or fight response. The area to the left of your amygdala, your hypothalamus, is going to kick your adrenal glands into action, and it's basically going to mean that it's going to release cortisol into your system. Now, when it releases cortisol into the system, some really fascinating research published by the Wharton Business School shows that when we're under the influence of cortisol, we're more likely to use our gut instinct, right? And the key message here is if you look at that top area of the brain there, the prefrontal cortex, when you're under the influence of cortisol, you bypass decisions on gut instinct. And that's a key trait in terms of people's financial behavior under stress, and people with a personality trait of neuroticism are more predisposed to anxiety and therefore reacting to that situation as a threat. And that's really the key insight here in terms of just a little bit of neuroscience behind this concept of uncertainty. Okay, so moving a little bit closer to the actual research itself. So in 2020, Momentum Investments used machine learning technology to really sift through a lot of data and uncover behavior patterns. So we uncovered, and basically these behavior patterns were based on investors' preferences or choices, right? So when we look at investors' preferences or choices, 5 distinct behavior patterns come out. And we're just going to have a quick recap on this before we go to the results of the study. The first is assertive investors, right? So assertive investors are those kind of people who they like cryptocurrency, they like the next big investment idea, and they're really kind of operating, kind of moving to investments that are performing very, very well because they don't mind taking risk too much. The anxious investor, we've talked about them already. So the anxious investor are obviously people who have that anxiety trait, and when markets are going to wobble, they're definitely going to be running into safety, right? They don't like actually taking too much risk. Avoiders actually keep their kind of feet completely out the water. They like to sit in the kind of cash world and cash plus, which obviously exposes them to inflation risk as well. Market timers are your herd type investors. They don't like being, sort of away from the herd. So they like doing what other people are doing. And I've left the contrarians to last because they're almost like a mythical creature, right? So the contrarians are like your typical Warren Buffett kind of investor. So, greedy when others are fearful, and fearful when others are greedy. And they actually were the only archetype to have a positive behavior tax, right? So they actually they added value by switching. Now we were particularly interested in this archetype because we thought, well, surely we can actually just use them as a model of behavior, right? So let's all be the contrarian investor. The trick, of course, is that the contrarian is also the most unstable archetype. So Joe Soap, for example, wasn't able to start as a contrarian in period one and stay there, right? So he kind of moved, or she moved in and out of the contrarian archetype, which means it's actually more of a luck thing than actually a deliberate behavior pattern. So the contrarian is one of the behavior archetypes that we might decide to drop in the future because it doesn't really explain real human behavior. All right, so let's move a little bit closer to how investors fared, or these archetypes fared in 2020. So we call this a report card for 2020 South African investors. Now, the big finding here as well was it was a little bit of a bloodbath. There was a lot of value lost. I mean, that's the long and the short of this. 1.53 billion rand was switched during 2020 from April until December in the year. The majority of the money that was switched by the avoider archetype, right? So these are people that operate in the kind of cash space, cash to cash plus. When market shock, they're the first to run for the hills. They don't like risk at all, right? But we see, and then we see the anxious investor switching about 22% of the behavior. Some other interesting insights: 11,608 switches last year. And we saw a very clear spike in switch behavior, about 300% of in March when the markets crashed, 300% of normal switch behavior levels, right? So there was a distinct risk-off strategy. Of course, that was followed by a very, very quick risk-on strategy. Again, the problem here is that people actually missed the recovery completely, and that's where the behavior tax came from. Right, how much was lost? Now, this is actually a very interesting insight because we see that avoiders switched the most, but they actually lost the least, or they lost one of the least levels. And the key insight here is that avoiders move away when markets crash, but they don't come back. And because they don't come back, they don't have this element of buying low, rather selling low and then buying extremely high again. So they actually end up losing slightly less. And we can see here basically that the anxious investor lost by far the most, 41%, or 410 million of the 100 million rand lost. So the key insight here, what the anxious investor is doing is they're moving very quickly when markets crash. But then it takes a little bit of, they need to get a bit more confidence to get back into markets. And by the time they get back into markets, they've missed the recovery completely, and they incur by far the largest behavior tax. All right, and then finally on the far right there, who paid the behavior tax? Well, that's a nice easy one. Everyone did, right? So if you switched in 2020, you paid a behavior tax. It's as simple as that. And you can see that this was shared kind of evenly between the anxious investor and the market timer. The market timer loses a little bit less. And the interesting thing about that is that because market timers are quite agreeable, they tend to get their feet wet again a little bit quicker than the anxious investor. And because they get their feet wet a little bit quicker, they tend to incur a little bit less of a behavior tax. But 6.5% overall lost last year if you switched as an investor, which is a lot of portfolio value. And in fact, as much as 19.44% of portfolio value was destroyed if you switched in August last year. All right, so that's just a nice summary slide, I think, as part of the pack, just to give you the highlights of, of the study. But I think sort of there's one, if we look to the future, for example, I mean, there's some very exciting times ahead, right? So when genetic sequencing, for example, becomes cheaper, you could very well find that a risk profile questionnaire in the future might actually be a finger prick blood test, because we know that we can pick up those kind of markers in people's genomes actually via once we're able to more cost effectively sequence genomes. I think maybe just one key concept, or maybe a rule of thumb to live by. So how do we, how can we start to approach a world where we actually don't incur a behavior tax? I mean, the quickest thing I can do is to give you one simple rule of thumb to live by from the presentation today. And that is very simply that if your investment goals are not changing, your plan to reaching those investment goals shouldn't be changing either. And that will definitely help to save you, to save this behavior tax. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation today, Paul. I think really giving us a reality check in terms of the value and the numbers that have been lost. And for a moment, I had a thought process where I thought, gosh, I want Warren Buffett's DNA. But as you said, genetics and looking at the contrarian archetype doesn't necessarily always guarantee the full role or structure or archetype of an investor over that particular journey. But we're looking forward to getting more details into these particular numbers and insights. And you too, of course, can keep watching and sharing some of your questions, which we will address with Paul a little later. But staggering figures that we see in the presentation, and of course, understanding that the switching mentality is what has actually cost a lot of investors in terms of growth on their investments. Well, we move now to understanding where all this anxiety comes from. And so often with us in the news and in the media, we refer to this as noise, right? Where we talk about the markets being up and the markets being down in some company news. But this time around, the noise is slightly different. It's really in terms of inherent behavior that takes place that is unaccounted for or not presumed to take place. But to help us understand this a little bit deeper and the impact that this does have not only on the quality and type of financial advice that clients receive, but also how clients absorb that advice and react to it, we're going to be taking a look at a presentation from our guest, Greg Davies. He's from Oxford Risk. Now, Greg holds a PhD in behavioral decision theory from Cambridge University, and he's also currently an associate fellow at Oxford's Said Business School. And he's a lecturer at Imperial College in London. So Greg will help us understand what exactly noise is and how this is impacting our financial planning and, of course, key behaviors that we need to be mindful of as this might shift the landscape in terms of how best we look to approach it. Greg, I'm quite excited to speak to you this morning, and you've joined us virtually. We're sure that your mic is not on mute. We've avoided those 2020 mistakes, right? But looking forward to the insight that you can share with us and primarily helping us understand and decipher what noise is and how this actually impacts the quality of investment decisions we take.
Good morning, and thank you for thank you for having me with you. Greetings from a sunny London this morning. Let me share my screen, and if someone could just confirm that you can see it, that would be helpful.
We can see it on our end, Greg. Thanks so much.
Splendid, thanks. So I'm terribly excited about this research that we've done, because it really is, I think, the first piece of research with a commercial organization of its sort. And this notion of noise is one that is becoming extremely topical. Now, a lot of the behavioral science that we've heard about over the last decade or more is really around bias, human bias, how we as humans are, when we make decisions, we're biased in one direction or another, and it's systematic, and we're all, irredeemably irrational. The concept of noise is slightly different. And the reason it's becoming very topical right now is the father of behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002. He has spent most of his career looking at how our decisions are biased. And together with Cass Sunstein, he is publishing a book on noise just next month. So it's an incredibly topical thing right now. But let me give you a sense of what it is that we mean by noise and why should we care. So look at those targets on the right-hand side of the screen there. If you're making judgments about something and you are unbiased and you're accurate, then there's going to be a little bit of variation in your judgments, but largely speaking, you're going to be on target and you're going to be closely clustered together. The concept of bias is the one that has really received most of the attention over the last 20 years. And it's this: we think we're on target, we're giving our decisions are tightly clustered, but they're off kilter in some way or another. And that's where a lot of that research has been showing how humans systematically err to one side or to the other. But that's not the only problem we have. It is possible for a system to have, on average, the right answer, but to be noisy. And that's the situation that we want to explore here. And of course, then we can be noisy and biased, which is the worst of both worlds. Now, the issue with noise is this. If, on average, your decisions are right, it might be that you look at your decision system and you go, and you look at all the dates and you go, yeah, we seem to be in the right place. There's not much bias there. Therefore, we're okay. We can ignore it. The problem is this. The problem is that every single one of those crosses is an individual, is a client, this might be in a medical system. You know, if every one of those patients is getting the wrong answer, it doesn't matter that on average the patients are getting the right answer. And the same is true in financial advice. For every one of your clients, if they are getting individually the wrong answer for them, it doesn't matter that on average your firm, your advisory firm, is giving the right answer. And so when we start looking at noise, it becomes really important. And it's something that I don't think that the financial industry yet has any idea how big or small this problem is. And that's why this study that we've been doing in conjunction with Momentum has been so exciting. If we look at advice, the solution that an individual client gets should be closely tailored to what they need and not to characteristics of the advisor. Giving consistency of advice is something that should be crucially important for any advisory firm, because if my advice is inconsistent, if it's noisy, then I've got a regulatory problem. I've got the situation where individual clients are getting the wrong answers. So it's how do we understand how much noise is in the system, and how do we then set about reducing that noise? Now, when we think about what the right answer is for financial advice, it really should be every client should get the answer that is specific to their needs, and their needs can be thought of in three layers. At the top there is how much risk are you willing to take in the long run? Your risk tolerance, your willingness to trade off risk and return of the outcomes 10 years down the line in your portfolio. And this, if we measure it right, is about something very fundamental and long-term and stable about your personality. Your risk tolerance is a personality trait that we can use psychometric tools to measure accurately. And it's one of those things that Paul was talking about, is establishing baseline willingness to take risk. However, at any point in your life, your willingness to take risk is by far not the whole picture. I also need to understand, what is your financial ability to take risk? What does your balance sheet look like? How big is your mortgage? What is your house worth? What are your spending plans? How many kids do you have to send to school? What is your retirement date? Every one of these things will change the right answer for the right level of risk for that person to have, and they will change it in very specific ways. And then lastly, this is all really the stuff that Paul has been talking about, and this is where the biases come in, is the amount of risk that someone should have depends not only on their circumstances and their long-term cool, calm, and collected willingness to take risk. It depends how they are likely to respond emotionally over the journey. Now, an advisor should be looking at a client and taking into account every one of those layers. And particularly the top two layers are ones that the financial regulators pay a lot of attention to. The bottom one has received very little attention by regulators or across the industry until quite recently. But what we want to know is, when an advisor looks at a client, are they using this information consistently, and are they using it sensibly? So a given client who sees the same advisor this month or next month should get roughly the same advice, or a given client who sees two different advisors in the same firm should be given roughly the same advice, because the advice should depend on the client, not on the advisor. Now, let's look at a bit of what we did. We used a study that has a previous academic pedigree. We used case studies, client vignettes, and every one of several hundred advisors was effectively given a little picture, a little portrait of 6 different clients, and they were given all the information that you might need to decide what is the willingness to take risk, what is that client's financial ability to take risk, and what is their emotional ability to take risk. And so in every one of these 6 cases, the advisors have all the information they need. Of course, there's some extra stuff that you would get in the course of a discussion with the client, etc. But the core of it is here. So there is a picture of who the client is, their biography. There is specific measures of aspects of their financial personality. Very importantly, their risk tolerance is given to them. And then there's a picture of their financial situation. And what we did is we asked each advisor for each one of these clients, what is the answer you would give? And the structure here is set up in a very specific way. So I'll just give you one example. each advisor was giving these clients in a completely randomized way, so there's no order effect. That's something that's very typical in psychological studies. But client 1 and client 4, for example, are exactly the same, except that they differ in risk tolerance. So this wasn't obvious to the advisors, but we're able to see, well, what did the advisor say for client 1 and client 4? And does it make sense, given that we know that client 1 and client 4 are only different in this one specific thing? So we used the study to do a number of those things. Sorry, let me be jumping ahead here. I'm going to jump straight into the answers because I think this is quite important. So one of the fundamental things we want to know at the end of it is, how much risk do I give to this client? And that is typically done on a 5-point scale from very low to very high, or a 7-point scale. We here used a 7-point scale. And so you can see here the answers that were given for each of these clients: client 1, client 2, client 3, client 4, client 5, client 6. Now, what you can see immediately is it doesn't matter which client this set of hundreds of advisors had in front of them. Pretty much everyone, the advisors gave answers from extremely low levels of risk to extremely high levels of risk. In other words, this system is phenomenally noisy. Exactly the same client scenario is given to several hundred advisors. And in those advisors, there are some who go, this person should have almost no risk in their portfolio. And this advisor is saying that this client should have huge amounts of risk in their portfolio. Now, there are a lot of subtle and interesting things going on here, and the full report digs into a lot of that in great depth. But the first thing to observe here simply is this process is noisy. And then the question arises, well, where does that noise come from, and how can we start to overcome it? Now, judging the suitable risk level, saying this client is a risk profile 7 or a risk profile 5 or a risk profile 3, that's one thing. But there's another stage to go, which is to say, once I know someone is a medium high, what portfolio do I build for them as a result? What level of equities, risky assets or safe assets do I put in the portfolio? Because you would hope that roughly the advisor community would agree that a medium high risk portfolio roughly looks like this and has this amount of risk in the portfolio. So let's have a look at those answers next. Now, the good news is this. On average, advisors gave more risky assets, more equity to higher risk individuals, higher risk clients than lower risk clients. So we see a steady increase. Clients that were deemed to be profile 1 got less risk typically than those who were risk profile 2, then risk profile 3, et cetera, et cetera. But again, what we see here is an enormous amount of noise in the process. So for example, let's just take risk profile 3. This green box here, that's 50% of the risk profile 3 clients fit in there. And the equity allocation there is varying for even the core clients in the middle between 30% and 50%. And some advisors were giving risk profile 3 up to 75% equities, and some were giving as little as 10% equities. So although we see that there's a regularity here, clients deemed to be to have a higher suitable risk level are given higher levels of equity. Again, there is an awful lot of noise in that system. And we can see here, for example, in risk profile 6, which really should get a very high level of equity, the range across advisors was everything from 100% all the way down to 15%. So that is a huge disparity. And we can see this even more clearly when we look at, well, once I couple together the fact that there's noise in me assessing what risk level this client should have, and then additional noise in me determining what level of equity I should give to that risk level, we can see here that for every one of these clients, the recommended equity allocation varied pretty much from somewhere less than 10% to somewhere greater than 90% for every one of the 6 client situations that we had. So this for me is indicative that as an industry, we should be worried about this. You have a client who walks through your door. That client says, I need you, the expert, to help me establish the right answer for my investment performance. And that client should be able to believe that the advisor sitting in front of them is going to give roughly the same answer as the next advisor they might see, or as that same advisor they might see in a month's time or 6 months' time. And this is pretty strong evidence that that just is not the case at the moment. The last thing I want to touch on is just so what does this tell us about how much noise is in the process and where that noise comes from? And again, I'm not going to dip into this chart in too much detail. There's a lot more richness in the underlying report. But what we looked at is to say we use statistical techniques to go, all this variation we're seeing, how much can we say comes from things that we've told people are different about the investor, about the client? How much of it comes from stuff that's different about the advisor? And how much comes from pure noise? So of all the variation, we can see that if I look just at characteristics of the advisor, of the investor, this investor has a different balance sheet, they have a different mortgage, they have a different risk profile, etc. All of that stuff explained only about 30% of the variation or 30% of the noise going on there. So well, 30% of the variation. So that basically tells you that 70% of how advisors are differing from each other is noisy in some way. Only 30% of it is coming from the stuff that really should influence the advice. We see then that if we jump from 28 to 32, 4%, if I add in how much can be predicted by characteristics of the advisor, that's quite encouraging. It's not too much. But for example, we do see in the data that advisors who themselves have higher risk tolerance are slightly letting that leak onto their clients. So if an advisor has a very high long-term willingness to take risk, they tend to give all of their clients more risk than an advisor who has less willingness to take risk. Now that, of course, shouldn't happen because the right risk level should depend on the client, not the advisor. But that's a relatively small amount, and that's encouraging. What we see then is this big jump from here. Let's go from 32 to 54%. A large chunk of about 20% of that variation is coming from the advisor's judgments. So the advisor, for example, is making judgments of what is this person's capacity to take risk. And that seems to be right, okay? The advisor should be judging someone's financial capacity to take risk. It was the middle bit of that pyramid. And that should be influencing their advice. The trouble is that that doesn't seem to be very closely related to the actual evidence, actual information we're giving on clients. So advisors are coming up with some sort of subjective assessment of how much risk can this client take. And they're using that assessment quite appropriately in order to say, here's the right level of risk for this client. But it doesn't seem to be related to the underlying pieces of information on that client in any systematic way. What this tells us is although advisors are using the information to come to a judgment, they're all doing so in slightly different ways. There is not a very clear model of how to combine risk tolerance and the size of your mortgage and the size of your goals together, such that a given client would give the same would get the same answer if they visited different advisors. And the last thing I want to point attention to here is once I add up all the observed variables, all the information that we have, all of that together explains 56% of the variation. That tells me that 44% of the variation between what clients were getting here is complete noise. It doesn't seem to arise from anything that we've put in front of the advisors. It's just complete noise in the system. Now, we don't really know whether 44% is particularly big or particularly small, but it does seem the case that 44%, nearly half of the variation of the answer a client gets, granted in these hypothetical situations, is unexplained by any information that the advisors have been given, does seem a concerningly high level. Now, I'm going to end with what we can do about this. The answer to a lot of this is to go, humans, we as humans, are very bad at processing lots of data, at juggling lots and lots of moving parts, at coming to a consistent answer for all of those reasons of bias that we've heard about earlier. Now, that's just how we are as humans. We're not good data processors, right? And any client situation involves huge amounts of information about all the assets on their balance sheet, all the liabilities on their balance sheet, all the things they might want to, their goals for the future, their retirement date. If there isn't a system to capture that information and track it and bring it together in a consistent way, then the system is the human. The system is some advisor subjectively bringing all this in and coming up with a subjective answer. So if we want to do this better, really it's the use of behavioral technology is where this is all going. And we think of at Oxford Risk, the future of behavioral science, much less about assimilating knowledge about psychology and telling people about their biases, and much more about building software and technology solutions that are based on data analytics to identify and track the individual circumstances of that person, using digital as a mechanism to do this rapidly and to be able to do it in real time for clients, and then using design to make sure that this system is there to enhance the decision making of the advisor. So none of this is about replacing the human element of an advisor, because that is absolutely vital. Because all the stuff Paul was talking about it leads us to the conclusion that if humans are going to make good decisions in the markets, they need to have emotional comfort. And it is very difficult to get emotional comfort from a diagnostic system that tells you the answer. That needs to come from the advisor. And that's where advisors are so valuable and so powerful. At the center of this is where the behavioral science comes. But we do have to remember this serenity prayer for artificial intelligence and for technology. Grant me the serenity to accept what computers do better than people, because there are things that computers do better than people. Grant me the courage to let people do what they do better than computers, because those exist too and they are vitally important, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you.
Greg, you've certainly given us something to think about. I like that serenity prayer, really different spin in terms of the things we need to accept and the things that we can manage and control. And that really does bring about a number of questions that I think many of our members in our audience might ask themselves as to how do we then manage this noise? How then do we approach interactions with our advisors? How do we as clients need to be cognizant of the decisions that we also take, given some of these elements of noise in the market that we might not even be cognizant of? So a number of questions, and you too can continue sharing some of your questions with us through the chat facility. A reminder that you do so by highlighting which organization you're from and where and who you are, and most importantly, who it is that you are addressing the question to. I'm quite excited, but I'm also anxious because it really calls for a different world that we'll live in terms of investments as well as finance. But to help us understand this world locally and globally, and most importantly, how it is that we as South Africans need to be more aware of some of these concerns going forward, we are now going to be joined by two other guests for a phenomenal panel discussion to help us unpack and really explore how it is that from an advisory point of view, advisors themselves perhaps are being more self-aware of these biases that exist. And of course, us as clients, how it is that we need to approach these conversations with our advisors. A lot to discuss, but we've got the right people in here to help us unpack this. So joining both Paul and, of course, Greg, I have David Kopp, who is the Executive Director of Relevance at the Financial Planning Institute of Southern Africa. David is passionate about financial planning, gaining a well-deserved professional status. He holds a BCom in financial management and a postgraduate diploma in financial planning law. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have the co-founder of Galileo Capital in the center of our panel discussion this morning, and former Financial Planner of the Year, Warren Ingram. Warren holds a bachelor's degree in social science and is also an active member on a number of public platforms, including CNBC Africa, 702, and MoneyWeb. He's often outspoken on the role of behavioral finance in financial planning. So quite excited. David right at the end, Warren in the middle. We have Paul with us here in studio, and of course, Greg joining us from what he describes as a sunny London. We'll ask you if that has any biases on the feedback that you've shared with us this morning here, Greg, on a lighter note. But gentlemen, I think this is going to be quite an engaging conversation. And maybe perhaps, Paul, let's start off with you before we speak to the advisors within the space to get some perspective. We've been very clear in terms of understanding the difference in terms of noise as well as bias. Bias we're well aware of and has been focused on, but noise is a new concept. And I think it's quite interesting that we see Momentum Investments really paying attention to this and bringing it to the forefront. Why is it so important for Momentum Investments to focus on noise and create the sense of awareness around it?
I think it's a great question. I think something we need to be very clear about at the start as well the point of the study, or the kind of intention of the study when we got into this, was we weren't trying to check the value of advice, for example. We already know that. That's a question that's been answered, by so many other papers before, by a number of other institutions as well. So it was never about, do financial advisors add value? We know that they do. However, though, from a client and understanding a client lens and checking when the client's check engine light is coming on is important to us, but that doesn't also mean that we can't understand what advisor behavior is and how it influences and impacts on the client's check engine light as well. Because obviously when, during this process of giving advice and reacting to market situations, there are two humans involved. There's a client as well as an advisor. So it's really all about being and getting better. It's not about the value of advice. It's about how do we get even better, because we know on average advice and advisors add a lot of value, but how can we help advisors to add even more value?
Sounds like you're echoing the sentiments I've shared with Greg. Absolutely. In terms of, right, humans keep doing what humans do best. Indeed. And using the technology to be a tool. We'll come back to that theme in just a moment. But Warren, you are someone who advises clients on a day-to-day basis. I can imagine reflecting on both the outcomes that have been shared by Paul regarding how South Africans have responded to the pandemic, and of course even seeing the feedback that Greg has shared with us regarding noise. How do you feel about the report as well as the outcomes that have come out?
It's almost as if someone's shone a light into something that I could see as a pinprick in the darkness, and suddenly there's a nice big bright spotlight to explain the behavior. So it's something intuitively I think we all know. I mean, we sit there and we can see that this stuff is happening. We can't give it a name, we can't quantify it, and we see ourselves and our colleagues in the industry giving variable advice. And I always think, sometimes we put it down to lack of education on the advisor's part, or bad intent or something like that. But often I think it's just that they are a human being, and they're swayed as much by the media and by events that's going on around the world, and then they impose that view on the client. So it's great to see the stuff in hard data to give it a kind of a mirror to what we're doing. And I think the follow-up to that is then, okay, so now we know that we're doing it, make sure we don't do it again, and finding the right way of preventing ourselves from imposing our views on the clients. I think that's going to be the trick in this whole thing.
Yeah. We have a name for it. We know how to identify it. But as you say, it's how we approach it. But you mentioned education. And David, I want to come to you here because you do represent the FPI, Financial Planning Institute of Southern Africa. And that speaks to the education and training, right, of planners. The 6 steps of financial planning are there, embedded. And one would assume that these 6 steps actually help us in terms of eliminating the noise that advisors would have in this particular arena. Is this still the case, or how are you seeing this balance off with the research and report and the findings that we're seeing this morning?
Yeah, so it definitely is still the case. And what's very interesting, I think the language around the 6 steps is changing, because it came into a 6-step process of financial planning, when actually what the 6-step process is practice standards around financial planning. And as we're seeing the role of the advisor changing from being the product advisor, which I think is where it started, to being the human advisor, the 6-step process is also undergoing a metamorphosis. So we're starting to talk more about these are the practice standards of financial planning. And why I say it's changing from a process is because it's not a case of you start with step 1 and you end up with step 6. With everything that's going on now, for instance, let's say I use on my website a retirement calculator, and a client comes in and starts inputting their data on the retirement calculator. Before I've established a relationship, I'm already collecting data. I then use the technology to analyze that data and maybe even tell them, listen, you've got a bit of a gap in your retirement planning. So we've already done step 2, 3, and a little bit of step 4. Later on, the client then, or potential client, his wife says, hey, have we done anything about the retirement planning? And that's when they remember they use the calculator. They come from my website, they phone me, and that's where we go back to starting to establish the relationship. So we're seeing the process is middle, but the framework is there. And the 6 areas that we cover in the practice standards are still very relevant today.
It's interesting you mentioned the relationship, right? Because one would wonder what needs to come first then, Warren, and maybe you can share some insight here too. Do you work on the relationship or do you work on the data? But I'm keen to get your feedback, because it almost seems from what we're finding here in terms of managing noise, humans need to do what humans do best. Not analyze the data, but establish that relationship. So is that a new theme and perhaps something that advisors will have to be cognizant of in the world going forward? Open to the both of you, but Warren, you can go first.
So I think you spoke about Warren Buffett earlier. Now, I was thinking if Warren Buffett was an advisor, he would probably tell everybody to have 90% of their money in an index
Yep.
and 10% in cash, because that's what he's told his executives of his state to do for his wife.
Yep.
And she's not young. He has, I mean, I'm sure he's got a good idea of her risk tolerance, but I mean, there is a rigorous model there by a very scientific person who probably has quite a low kind of connection to human beings on an emotional level. So I think our industry comes from that, where we've been quite scientific in looking at a financial model and saying, okay, this is what you should do according to the textbook. Let's just do that. And you forget about the human being on the other side of that textbook. And so I think the answer is we start with the human being first, because the textbook might be fundamentally wrong for the human being on the other side of the table. There might be things in that person's life that might relate to their own emotional state, that might relate to the well-being of their family, that have absolutely nothing to do with a number on a calculator or on a financial model. And if you can't address the human issue first, the models are useless.
Yeah.
And we've seen that time and time again. So I think that's where you're going, David. I mean, we've been so good at training our industry to deal with numbers and to get better at those things, but we haven't focused a heck of a lot on the human being. And listening to Greg, what I'm getting is I need to recruit psychologists and then spend a bit more money on systems, because the systems can deal with all the technical stuff. And then I've got to get psychologists to talk to the human being and understand the human being.
Sure. A very interesting narrative that you share there. David, are you nodding in agreement?
Yeah, I agree totally with that. And I think the reality is and I've got to get this right, we've been trained as advisors in the past to focus on the quantitative elements, so the money side of it. Okay. I joined the industry about 20 years ago, and the training at that stage was ask someone how much money they want if they die, how much money they want if they become disabled, and how much money they want if they retire, and then you work out a financial plan around that. But the change in focus is now more on the qualitative factors. So in terms of establishing a relationship, it's exactly that, is let's first understand why you came to talk to me as a financial advisor. So what are those needs? And the 6-step process has always included that. It said we've got to gather qualitative information about the client. So I need to know a lot more about you, about your relationship with money, about your understanding with money, how these things impact on your life. And then, yes, so what are your life goals? And that's in the definition of financial planning. It's a process to marry basically your life goals with your financial capability of it. And that is coming more and more to the fore. And it's not regulation that's pushing it, because in my opinion, regulation is still very much focused on the financial product. I think a lot of what's happening is the clients, number one, are pushing it because they're wanting more from their advisor. And secondly, there are practitioners out there who are realizing this is the changing world of financial planning, and they are actually driving that change by adapting what they do as financial planners. And I think it's the practitioners that are leading from the front, and then everything else is catching up with it.
That's refreshing to hear, especially in terms of the practitioners driving that change and also clients being more cognizant of that element. I'll come to risk tolerance in a moment, as well as regulation and technology, but the speaking and keeping with the emotional element. Port, I'd like to get your feedback, because when we look at the archetypes, a lot of it looks like it's driven by, again, the emotions driven by bias, right? It's the anxiety, it's the fear, or it's the greed. And are we finding that as clients, when we speak to our advisors and we approach them, we're already stepping into the conversation on the back foot because we're anxious? We're facing uncertainty, and there's a fearful element in terms of, I don't know if I have enough, I don't know if it will last, and if it does last, how long for, and who will it go to? All these other elements that might actually sway the client's approach when they enter that conversation.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. I mean, and I think if we look at a bit of neurobiology behind that as well, if you look at we spoke about cortisol being the stress hormone. If you look at oxytocin, that's kind of the love and trust hormone, right? So depending on the relationship you have with someone, and kind of their oxytocin levels, for example, and if they trust you, they're going to be in a much better position to, when you say, hang on, we've seen this all before. They're obviously much more, they're going to be much more inclined to agree, or rather to stay with that advice, than if you have a very transactional relationship with your client. So, if you don't have that trust, or there isn't that trust connection, it can be a problem. And it's actually, the crazy thing about this is we've actually seen in individual cases that sometimes the advisor has managed to keep the client on the line just long enough to destroy even more value, because they actually keep the client invested right until the bottom of the market, and the client's like, okay, that's it, I'm out. So it's such an important relationship here to have trust between clients and advisors. and trust can only come from having the client's best interest at heart, right? And people are, by the way, very, very good at picking that up.
Right.
And that's just part of our DNA as well. I mean, that's a survival kind of technique. So that would be my kind of 5 cents on that.
An unfair question, but how do we build trust in a COVID world where our interactions with our advisors are all virtual now, given the pandemic that we're living in?
I actually think it's probably easier than we think, because the way to build trust is to do, as Paul says, start with acting with the client's best interest at heart, and someone can pick that up whether you're sitting face to face or across a machine, but at the same time asking the right questions. So I think a lot of the time now, what we're talking about, because I'm going to jump to the solution. I mean, what I'm listening to, from both Greg and Paul is, I've got to ask better questions, and it's much more about understanding a human being. And maybe I've got to talk less in those meetings and listen more and follow up with that human being side of it. And once someone feels like they've been heard, the whole conversation changes. So I think that it's actually quite easy to build trust if you act with the right intent, ask good questions, and don't impose your view on the person. Let the person be the expert in the room, and you help guide them to where they need to go.
Getting to know the client better. Well, we'll follow up on a few other questions, but I do want to remind you at home and those of you watching, members of the media, that we do want to encourage you to share some of your questions. So please do get typing, sharing some of your questions, and we will address them in just a moment with the various panelists that we have on board. It is important to note that to ensure that we're able to get an answer that is concise and meets your needs, please do remind us as to who it is that you're addressing your question to, just to ensure that you provide clarity in terms of who the question is for, and we will address those questions in just a moment. Type them into the chat service, tell us who you are, the agency that you're representing, and who the question is for, and we'll address that in just a moment. I want us to come back to an element of risk tolerance, which was alluded to by Greg in his presentation earlier, and that very interesting chart in terms of the variances, right, of the noise that might sway the advice that a client might receive. And I'm keen to understand from both you, Warren, and David, in terms of risk tolerance, what does it mean to you in terms of your business as you continue to analyze that data, but balance getting to know a person, and how it does translate into the quality of advice that you actually offer your client? David?
Yeah, so I'm going to approach it first from the regulatory viewpoint, which essentially states I need to give advice as a financial advisor, or financial advisors need to give advice based on the client's risk profile. Now, the problem is risk profile is not defined anywhere in the law, so it's open to a lot of interpretation. And some people have gone the route of saying, well, I'm going to define risk profile as the objective, and I'm going to focus on the objective and work out the risk based on the objective. Some people have said, I'm going to define it as risk tolerance, so I'm going to do a questionnaire, and based on that questionnaire, I'm going to put a client in a box, and that's what I'm going to do it. What we're actually talking about, and that's what Greg's slide was about, your risk profile is an interplay of your risk capacity, so your ability to take risk, your risk tolerance, so how you react to risk, and then also your objective comes in. So it's an interplay of all three of those elements. And that's an issue that we're actually grappling with as the industry at the moment. So the FPI and the FIA, the Financial Intermediaries Association, has put together an industry work group that consists of academic practitioners and FPI as a professional body. And we're looking at this issue of a risk profile. And we're building on white papers that were issued in 2014 and 2016. And hopefully we'll get to a common industry understanding of what a risk profile is, and put a framework together in how you engage with your clients and determine the risk profile. And I think this research just highlights the importance of doing that work and understanding it.
Yeah, very true. Greg, we've kept you quiet for way too long, so I want to rope you into the conversation now, perhaps to build up on that element that David has highlighted in terms of this global move to really ensure that there is a consensus as to how we analyze risk profiles, and how this might be tangible for the market and the industry, but also bearing in mind that whilst we look to be globally competitive and reach global consensus, we still need to be locally relevant to the customers and clients that we serve.
Yeah, I think that one of the important things, and we've done studies of risk tolerance all around the world, and the good news there is the tools you can use to assess someone's psychological trait for their long-term willingness to trade off risk and return actually function pretty well wherever you are in the world. Sometimes you have to make some slight calibration differences depending on the data. But the notion is one that is fundamental to being human. It is not one that is particularly different if you're in South Africa or you're in London or you're in Singapore or you're in New York. And I think that is encouraging because it means with a relatively simple psychometric tool, you can quickly take off one very important aspect that suitability should be anchored on. Now, you're right. I mean, there are all these different interpretations, and that, to my mind, is more the problem. Is different countries' regulatory bodies interpret them in different ways. The compliance departments of organizations in those countries then interpret those in different ways. We also have a situation where the terminology is used differently. So we talk here about risk tolerance. Now, I would mean something quite specific by risk tolerance, but other people will use risk tolerance to mean something different. And you've got this sort of mishmash of language. So is someone's risk attitude the same as their risk tolerance? I would say no, because my risk attitude, my willingness to take risk right now, is a combination of my long-term willingness to trade off risk and returns and all the stuff that Paul was talking about. What have I read in the newspaper this morning? Is it sunny? Is it so? My short-term attitude to take risk is actually different to my long-term willingness to trade off risk and return in my portfolio. We have to be very clear about that, because if we measure the wrong thing, you're going to end up building for someone a portfolio based on how they feel this morning, which is a very poor foundation for a portfolio they're going to have to stick with for the next 10 or 20 years. But there's a lot of jargon and complication that, as an industry, I don't think we've done ourselves any favors, and I mean that genuinely globally. I think this is a problem in every part of the world at the moment.
Interesting, because I'm keen to find out then, does that call for increased regulation or perhaps different global interpretations? I guess the open-ended question is, how then do we resolve that particular challenge? Greg, I'll pass that to you, and any of the guests here in studio, if you're open to take it, well, we'll get your response. Greg, your thoughts first?
So I'm always very reluctant to call for more regulation. I think I think there are aspects where perhaps the regulators need to say more, and that is around these behavioral elements. There's very little in the regulation about questions of neuroticism or anxiety and how that should play in. So there's scope for some expansion there. And we're also seeing expansion of regulation in areas around people's broader values. So ESG investing, socially responsible investing. And I think regulation is going to come up there. With regard to risk tolerance, I don't think the regulators anywhere need to be terribly dogmatic about how it is used, but I would like them to see them be more vocal about what we know to be bad practices. There are a lot of very, very bad risk tolerance assessment tools out there, and they're bad precisely because they are measures of what you feel this morning, rather than measures of what is the right thing to do for your 10-year portfolio. And the regulators, rather than say, you should do X, I think they should rather do, you should do what you feel best, but don't do A, B, C, D, E, and F, because we know that those things are bad approaches. So it's more regulation by keeping people away from the bad stuff, rather than being particularly dogmatic about what advisors should do.
I must tell you, a lot of your colleagues are nodding here in terms of the agreement, and maybe Warren and Paul, you can give us your feedback.
I think we need less regulation, in all honesty. I think the interesting thing about regulation is what it always does is it drives a lowest common standard. So it forces people to tick boxes. So I know when I deliver a plan to a client, what's critical to that human being is probably 2 or 3 pages of information. And then I'm giving them another 25 pages of information to make the regulators happy, to make my compliance people happy. It means nothing to the client, and it's ticking a whole lot of boxes. It makes everyone else happy, and there are lots of lawyers involved in all this stuff, and I'm sure it's keeping them busy. But the human being on the other side of the table that needs a solution that's best for them, it's actually a very short amount of information, and it's really about providing a certain level. So I think as little regulation as possible. I like the idea of saying get rid of the bad practices, and then focus on the right thing. And I think also, I mean, that's pretty easy to do. Just change the way people get paid. Change the way the industry pays people. Get rid of upfront commissions, all of that nonsense, and watch
which we've seen right over time in South Africa, specifically with R2R.
Sure. And just watch how the right remuneration drives the right behavior time and time again. And we can get rid of a lot of the lawyers out of the system because they don't understand financial planning. I promise you that.
At least that does provide a lot of feedback there, and some critical elements that we do need to consider, but less regulation. I think that's been very clear in terms of how to manage it. David?
Yeah, and I think that's a positive move about regulation in South Africa at the moment. It is moving away from that rules-based regulation. So there will still be some rules, but we're moving into an environment where the legislation will be principle-based, and it will be up to the individual advisor or the individual advisory firm to say that this is the way that I'm implementing that. And it's based on client outcomes as opposed to ticking a box, because we've seen cases that things have gone horribly wrong, and you open up the compliance file and it's perfect. Okay, those boxes are ticked, the client signed everywhere that they're supposed to sign, but things have still gone wrong for the client. And if your focus is on ticking a box and not your focus on, am I doing the right thing for my client, it is going to go wrong for the client.
Yeah. Well, I think we've established quite a great chunk of the conversation today in terms of focusing on the client first, establishing that relationship, understanding that human beings need to play to their strengths in terms of getting full details of what the client's objectives are and working according to the 6 steps of financial planning that have already been established into gaining that clear objective. There are a few other elements that we'll touch on in just a moment, but I do want us to address a question that we have from one of our audience members, Gareth Stokes, who's from FA News, I think a familiar name to some of our guests here in studio. He asks a question to any of the behavior specialists. Is there not an argument to focus more on risk-based investment templates or model portfolios to eliminate noise and biases? Let me read that one more time just to make sure that it is quite clear. He does ask, is there not an argument to focus more on risk-based investment templates or model portfolios to eliminate noise and biases? Great question, and I think quite in depth. Paul, you can go ahead and
yeah, look,
respond.
I mean, I think it's a good question. So if we look at establishing a way, establishing a model portfolio, via an outcomes-based unit trust or a DFM, or however you decide to do that, is a good way to eliminate the investment noise. So, that's a good way to make sure that there's a bunch or a mix of assets that are specifically designed to help a client get to a goal. So in that respect, absolutely, I completely agree with the statement. However, there's a lot of messy stuff in between, though, which is still going to happen when markets shock or tank, or there's still going to be the client interaction in that equation. So there's two dimensions to that. It's definitely a very, very good way, kind of having a good asset allocation approach to having the right mix of stuff to get to an investment goal is a very, very good way. And I think the way the globe is really moving in terms of solving for investments. And really that's going to help clients as well. I mean, there was a global survey done a while back on kind of this, there's a move away from this investment alpha scenario, because clients still aren't reporting to reaching their investment goals. So let's forget about investment alpha and market benchmarks. Let's have a look at client benchmarks and moving to personal benchmarks for clients. Model portfolio is a great way to do that, but there is still that kind of human element that sits in between when markets are going to provide that noise. So.
I'm sorry, I can't help myself.
Go ahead.
I think it's 20% of the story. It's a focus. It's a product focus. We're talking about the numbers, the science. So he's eliminating advisors moving clients proactively from equities to bonds or cash or whatever at the wrong time. Great. It's still about the advisor, actually. That question, I think. If we're talking about the human being, the client on the other end, that's not the solution. It's far from the solution. In fact, that's just refining good products and great. So the product's 20% better than it was, and it's 20% of the story. It's not the answer.
So would that be one of the elements that you would then avoid in terms of the shift and move in terms of where we're going to, or still incorporate, but at a much more minimal level,
yeah,
just for clarity?
It's just saying that that we refine the way that money gets managed better. That's great. Well, I like that. Well done. However you want to do that, but actually that's not the story. I think if we leave today with that as the answer, we've missed the whole boat.
David, would you like to add? Greg, I'm not too sure if you want to add to that feedback as well regarding the question. Greg, let's start with you. David will come.
Well, I mean, I think there are 3 chunks here. So the one is, can I identify the right suitable risk level for this client and their circumstances? The second step is, once I've identified that risk level, can I build a portfolio that matches it, and how am I clear about what matches? And the third one is, can I then manage the client's emotions such that they can stick with that? And this model portfolio scenario is, I think, a very useful way, but to the earlier comments, it's only a small part of the solution because it only solves that middle bit, which is once I've identified someone is a medium-high risk level, we really do need to have a clear idea of what we mean by medium-high risk that drives consistency, and we need to then be able to enable the the investment managers to eliminate their own biases, and that's where some of the model portfolio stuff comes in. You do, however, let's imagine you go, here's a client who's a risk profile 4. It doesn't help us if risk profile 4 can have anything from 20% equities to 80% equities, because you may as well not have done the first part of that process at that point.
Mm.
So you need to know what risk profile 4 means. Then you can build a model portfolio to fit it. But it is true that, if I want to build something that has a specific risk level, we don't have to be prescriptive about what the model portfolio is, because there's a billion different asset allocations that will deliver the right risk level. What we do need to know is, once we've built one, how do we stick to it systematically?
Valid point. David, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think in the simple language, the product is a destination. And I think what we've done in the past, we've always started with the destination in mind and then figured out how to get there. And I think what Warren's talking about, and forgive me if I'm taking words out of your mouth, the journey is the important part. So that 80% that you're talking about is, how do we get to the destination, and how do we get there that is based on the client's needs? If I need to be in Cape Town in 4 hours, I cannot then say, well, take this bicycle and you'll get there. I need to use an airplane to get there. And it's understanding that need. It's understanding what the client is trying to achieve. And then, yes, having a product that is suitable and correct for the client and well designed and everything is then brought on at the end of the journey, rather than starting with it in mind. Because I sometimes think people go in with a preconceived notion that, this client, I'm going to give this product and figure out how to get there, rather than figuring out what the client needs and then selecting a well-designed product to service that need.
Yeah. I think very valid points that have been mentioned. And I certainly hope, Garth, that they do, or Gareth, that they do address the question that you've asked to our panel. A reminder that we are taking more questions, so please do feel free to type them into the chat box. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and most importantly, who you are addressing your question to, and we'll address it with the panel here too. One element that I want us to touch on is for naysayers, right? Because we live in an age of technology, where we have instant gratification servicing our needs. And some people might say, hold on, do I even still need an advisor who might want to work on the emotional elements with me? I actually just want to get to the destination, David. So you know what? Give me a robo-advisor any day, and let's cut out the biases that might exist in the market. Is that still a theme? And to someone who thinks that, how do you actually respond to it in terms of robo-advisors, and if that's just the shortcut that we need to opt for?
Yeah, so again, this is an area that's interested me a lot, obviously, because I'm a human, and I agree totally with Greg. Use the technology to do the stuff that it does better, and the human stuff better. Now, interesting, Better Finance, which is a consumer advocates in Europe, issued a report in December 2020 talking about, can you trust the robots? And one of the elements they looked at, and what they did is they did it slightly different. They had a millennial profile, and they had a baby boomer profile, and through a mystery shopping exercise, they sent this to 14 different robo-advisors. Now, again, on the baby boomer profile, so exactly the same client information, the equity allocation ranged from 9% to 95% in the 41. So again, I would say that's probably not noise, because I think each robo-advisor would probably consistently give the outcome, but I think that's where the bias angle comes into it. So depending on, and remember, at this point in time, okay, I'm not saying it's going to be different in the future, but at this point in time, humans are still programming the technology. So those biases are programmed into the technology. So from that viewpoint, there was different, from the 14 different robo-advisors, there were 14 different asset allocations. And that's, again, where I think the human advisor becomes very important, because what do I understand my client to look like? And yes, if I'm going to use a robo-advisor to manage the asset allocation, am I matching my client to the right robo-advisor based on their needs? And I think that's where the human aspect is still very important.
Yeah. Warren, you want to add something?
I mean, I think, so some of those are just terrible robo-advisors. That's probably the answer. I think a high-quality robo-advisor in the current setup, it deals with very specific needs. So you can get a very good outcome for an investor who has a particular goal. So if someone says, my wife's pregnant, we're going to have the baby. We know that's a finite thing. Our baby is going to go to school at a certain time. I'd like to start saving for that particular outcome. I think there are many good robo-advisors that can do that. I think there aren't good robo-advisors yet that can zoom out to look at the whole individual and all of their circumstances, all of their goals, their aspirations, etc., and say, we can give you the right outcome for now. I think it's coming. But my short answer is a high quality robo-advisor today is much better than a bad advisor today. So we can eliminate bad advice.
Are you putting yourself out of a job here, Warren?
Well, I'm hoping I'm a good advisor. so I think the answer is that I would trust a decent quality robo-advisor over a bad advisor any day. But I think that it's going to, the machines are going to get better. They are going to get better.
And how do you find decent quality? Was decent quality right across the board? But as David mentioned, it's about the algorithms and the human element that ties into those particular platforms. So I guess the question that I'm really trying to ask here is in terms of that sweet spot, the behavioral sweet spot that Greg alluded to, data, design, as well as technology, in terms of what's right in the center there that actually makes all of this function.
So I mean, listening to or looking at those circles of Greg's,
yes.
I think the answer is going to be the very best advice will come from human-led robo-advice. So me as a human being using machines to answer a lot of questions, to gather a lot of data, to get to a very good outcome, and then I'm tweaking that outcome at the end to go back to the original human being that we dealt with in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's going to be the big answer. Identify high-quality robo-advisor right now. I don't know the answer. I think it's one of those things we have to do a bit of homework on it.
Mm-hmm.
Fees count, intent and test driving, etc., etc. But for an ordinary human being investor who's not a professional, I don't know how they judge a good robo-advisor from a bad one. I think it is a good question. I don't know.
Greg, maybe you can respond to this one. I saw you nodding vigorously with the solution that Warren shared with us in terms of that behavioral sweet spot.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things here. One is the big problem with almost all. There's two big problems with. One is there's too much robo and there's not enough human to give the emotional comfort that's required. The second problem is they don't give any advice. Most robo advisors simply do not assimilate enough information about the investor and their holistic situation to genuinely say they're giving advice. They're just flogging a portfolio, which is a quite different thing. And I think the right answer is it's technology assisted advice. Every human advice process, the human bit of that can be a better, more consistent version of themselves if they use more technology. But the technology should always be there to support and empower and enhance the human and make the human more consistent, not to knock the human out. Because the human is a vital element in terms of helping people to judge where to go. And I think there's a parallel here that I find quite useful is medical. If you go to the doctor, you don't want the doctor just sitting and asking you a bunch of questions and then telling you what they think is wrong with you. Right? You want the doctor to be using all the technology at their disposal to diagnose your problem. If you need a blood test, you want a blood test. You want an MRI scan, you want an X-ray, you want all the technology. And that's there to provide an accurate diagnosis. Sorry, I think there's something flash up on my screen. That's there to provide an accurate diagnosis. But you don't want the machine to tell you what to do about it. Because what to do about it means what lifestyle choices am I prepared to make? Should I undergo the operation now, or should I wait for a few years until my kids have finished school? Am I prepared to undertake the lifestyle changes, the dietary changes? These are not answers that the machine can provide. So there's a distinction between diagnosis and prescription. And I think the same is true in advice. The diagnosis, we want as much technology as possible to help do the stuff that humans aren't good at. And the prescription is, what do I do about it? How do I reconfigure my life? And that is a very human-led conversation. And that's never going to be done effectively by a robot.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and I certainly see the elements connecting in terms of the feedback that has been shared between yourself and your colleagues. But I'd like to go back to your presentation as well as the element of the biases and maybe even the noise that might exist. And maybe you can take us a few steps back to understand that biases and noise also does not only just speak to the element of financial advice, but a variety of sectors. You mentioned healthcare with doctors, and I understand that there's a particular interesting case within the law fraternity, how the outcome of rulings can change depending on how judges might be influenced by noise. Something as simple as what they had for breakfast or how recently they had lunch might actually trigger particular outcomes. And using that example, Greg, I'm hoping you can walk us through understanding how with this human-led element of financial advice, which is empowered and enabled by technology, that even though the human element is still present, we are able to eliminate some of those biases as well as the noise that exists in the client advisor interaction.
Yeah. So I have to say, there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical about that judge story, but the basic principle is that across a set of data on parole decisions that judges were making parole decisions, it turned out that the likelihood of someone being granted parole was strongly correlated to how close their case came up after the judge had had something to eat. So the glucose levels of the judge varying during the day would change the likelihood that that judge was going to say you can have parole or you can't have parole. Now, clearly, that should not happen. That is something that is utterly unrelated to the case influencing it. And despite being skeptical about the strength of the results in that particular case, we know that this happens in a variety of ways. We know that our judgments fluctuate during the day. We can think of our decision making like a muscle. If you use it a lot, it gets tired. And you've probably all seen this. You know, it's much easier to be good on your diet in the morning, but at the end of the day, when you're tired, you just don't have the willpower and the energy to not pick up the chocolate cake or whatever it may be. So all of these things do influence us. It could be our mood, it could be our level of tiredness, and they will change the answers that we give. Now, the question there, I guess, is if we are using technology to provide a bunch of more objective outcomes that are feeding into our process, rather than relying on our own ability to subjectively assimilate and process this stuff, it takes one source of noise out of the process. It doesn't take everything out, but it says that I, as a human, am allowing the technology to do the heavy lifting for me and provide me with a guidance system. And then I can make my decisions within that guidance system. And at that point, my decisions are going to be less emotionally motivated. They're going to be less variable according to how tired I am, etc. It doesn't solve every problem, but what it does, it means I can be more consistently the best version of myself that I should be, regardless of when I last had a meal, how I'm feeling, how my family life is at home, how I'm feeling about COVID. So we're trying to knock some of that stuff out by putting it into a more robust process and using technology to help us be better humans.
Fantastic. And I think a very valid point. I was actually looking at both David and Warren just to check your sugar levels. I know it's still breakfast time, so maybe this is the best time to speak to you on a lighter note. Just teasing you there in terms of that factor that has come through. We have another question, though, that's been shared by Gareth from FA News. And this particular question is for you, Greg. And the question asks, how does your study of noise or bias account for the fact that a predetermined financial outcome could be achieved from vastly different asset allocation strategies? Greg?
Yeah, so I think, and this relates a little bit to the question earlier around model portfolios, is I don't think we need to be prescriptive about asset allocations and which one to use. There are, different organizations, different advisor firms, different advisors will have different skill sets. Some might be better at delivering a level of risk with more use of active equity strategies. Some will have skills elsewhere, and referencing Warren Buffett, the circle of competence. We should all strive to be making decisions inside our circle of competence and not outside. What is important is first identifying what is the level of risk that is right for this client, and do I have a systematic way of linking that level of risk to the build of an asset allocation that uses my expertise. But it could be, one person could say, I'm going to deliver this level of risk with this mix of assets. Someone else will do it with a different mix of assets. For any risk level, there are a million different asset allocations that will deliver that risk level, as long as it's sufficiently diversified across asset classes, and there's a systematic process to make sure the risk matters. So I really don't think that we should be too prescriptive about what the right way of delivering a level of risk is, because it will depend on who's delivering it. What we do need to be prescriptive about is, in the long term, can I be confident that it's doing what it says on the tin with regard to the risk level I'm giving to this client?
Thanks for that response there, Greg. We see that you're a very busy man, but all understood in terms of the call that you might be receiving. And thank you for responding to that question. I'd like to bring it back to the studio to get some feedback from the advisors. It really does seem as though we've placed quite a bit of responsibility on advisors, and I guess rightfully so, given the role and responsibilities that you serve in the life of your clients, in terms of being cognizant of eliminating the noise as well as the biases that might exist. But what's the responsibility of clients? If I walk into a meeting and sit opposite either of you, Warren and David, are there elements that we as clients also need to be cognizant of when we approach these conversations? Again, not going back to the anxiety and the fear in terms of positioning our financial story or financial goals, but are there elements that we as clients and South African clients specifically need to be cognizant of when approaching their conversations with advisors?
I'll put you on the hot spot.
Thank you. So I think it's about, I mean, to stay with the medical analogy, if you're sitting in front of your doctor and you don't tell them all the things you're doing wrong, you don't tell them about your behaviors. When the doctor says, you know, are you eating correctly? Are you running? You know, are you doing your exercise? And you just say, yes, I'm doing all of that. Yes, and actually you're not. Then the reality is you're going to get a bad outcome from the doctor because you're not being truthful and open with the doctor. And I think it's the same in this situation. You know, the advisor is only as good as the information that's delivered to the advisor. And there's some information you can take automatically. There's things you can collect and get really accurate data on. But for example, if the client overspends all the time, and they're just going to overspend forever, and they know that about themselves already. And when you sit down with them and you say, okay, at retirement, you want to spend 100,000 Rand a month, is that accurate? And the client says, yeah, of course it is. And actually, they already know they're going to spend 130,000 a month. That we've got a problem there. So if the response, what should the client do? I think the client needs to be as open and as honest as they can about their position, about their known strengths and weaknesses with money. There'll be a lot that they don't know. They might not necessarily know, are they highly risk tolerant in market crashes? If they've never really invested before because they worked for a salary, they had a pension, they won't know until the day they retire actually how they react.
Even though we've been through this last year and this particular pandemic and have actually witnessed some behaviors there.
So if I'm working for a big corporate and I get a salary and I get that salary every single month and my pension fund's managed and I don't really worry about it because it's all taken care of, the first time I become a professional investor is the first month I no longer work for a salary and I'm living with my retirement money and the decisions are now mine as the client. And so they won't necessarily know. They can't necessarily be dishonest about something they are ignorant about.
Sure.
But there are lots of things that they know about and they need to be honest about those. And then it becomes a much more productive conversation.
To build up on that, and of course, even the research that Paul was also able to share with us in terms of how investors were switched between products and actually might have responded. Are you able to share with us perhaps any learnings in terms of interactions with clients who might have wanted to switch in the last year and how you've managed some of those emotions in terms of carrying them through this particular journey, David?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to talk on the academic viewpoint because I'm not actively advising
Sure.
at this point. But I think, and again, building on Warren, what he said, it's a relationship, and a relationship is not one way. If it's a one-way relationship, it's a bad relationship. So it is a two-way relationship. So yes, being open and honest with your advisor and being prepared to work the journey. So being honest about why you're approaching an advisor in the first place. So what do you want to get out of the relationship? And yes, if it's just, I've got a single outcome and I want advice on that single outcome, or is it a longer term holistic approach that you want to look at? And then being open to taking the advice and implementing the advice. Okay, so if it's a case of a client coming and saying, look, I want to switch. And as an advisor, you're going, but look at the study, look at what you potentially could do. And what Paul said in his presentation, we've got the plan, your goals haven't changed, let's stick to it. It's the ability to actually take that advice and trust in the process that I think is very important from a client side. And you know, we surveyed members of the FBI at the beginning of the pandemic, and a lot of the advice that was being given was, don't do anything right now. Okay, hold the course. That's that sort of majority of advice. And again, that's counterintuitive to how somebody might be feeling, because they're going, you're telling me to hold the course. I'm seeing my investments tanking. But if you did that, you lost what, up to 19% or 6.5% on average, 100 million Rand wiped out because you didn't stick the course.
Yeah. Very true in terms of those words. And of course, that guidance that goes back to that relationship. I'm cognizant of the fact that we have about 5 minutes or 7 minutes left of this conversation, and we're happy to squeeze in any final questions that many of you might have to our panelists. But really, in terms of understanding where we are in terms of this conversation, is understanding that there are archetypes and behaviors that we as investors often display, specifically when we're faced with challenges and fear of actually seeing further losses in our investment portfolios. Those numbers were shared with us by Paul in terms of 100 million being lost, the switching that took place, and of course the various investor archetypes in South Africa specifically that would have experienced losses just by purely not sitting on their hands. So that reminds us once again of one of those important principles of time in the market versus timing the market. One thing that's quite clear is the value of advice. It just cannot be discounted. Having professionals who have studied, who have gone through the course, and are able to actually sit opposite South African clients to not only adequately understand their needs, but meet their needs through the power and enablement of technology to run through the data and the processes to evaluate their risk tolerance. That's where the human relationship then can continue to be enhanced to ensure that we journey together in reaching the financial goals and objectives that individuals really have. Another key element that we've already highlighted is the power and the collaborative efforts between technology and the data that is shared, and of course understanding how we design those elements to ensure that we leverage off of the power of technology, however still doing what humans do best in terms of establishing those emotional connections to drive the financial goals that we have broadly as the South African and global public. But one thing's quite clear is that this is not unique to the financial services industry. It's not unique to the South African market. It is unique to humans as it is human nature. So what do we do going forward as humans in our personal capacity as clients, in our capacity as leaders of the Financial Planning Institute, in our capacity as advisors and leaders of corporate industries that look to meet the needs of South Africans in reaching their objectives and goals? We understand that there is emergence of all of these elements, but I'm keen to understand as we take this conversation forward, as we might meet here from a year from now to follow up on the lessons that have been learned and the elements that have been introduced. What is it that we need to take forward in this conversation? And perhaps what is it that we can commit to as the FPI, as a financial planner, as Momentum Investments, as Greg, who's giving us more of an academic background, as to what it is we can commit to make sure that we pay a more focused attention to behavioral finance, and most importantly, ensure that we manage to navigate the landscape with as minimal noise and bias as possible. I'll give you each 30 seconds each to respond to this. David, from the FPI's perspective, what could we do?
I think there's a shift in financial planning happening, and it's a shift away from product first to client first. And it's more a case of, if I understand my client and my client's needs, and the first value in our code of ethics is client first. And if we start with that point, I think a lot of this we will be able to solve.
Client first. Warren?
Understand the human being. If you're the advisor, understand the person behind the numbers, understand what's driving them. Don't debate in the moment of a switch. Don't debate the financial facts. Rather go back to the core driver of what's moving that client to ask you to switch or to panic or whatever the deal is. Address the issue, whatever that emotional issue is. You move the client out of that emotional fear state, and you can have a rational conversation thereafter. But don't start on the rational debate. You're not going to win.
Paul?
Yeah, so the first big word for me is data. So as a financial services provider, we have something extremely valuable. We have a gold mine of data. And with that, behavioral science is a data science because it's about what people do, right? So without that data and with our, with the data we have, we've got a responsibility to be able to educate advisors and clients into making better financial decisions. And there are a number of techniques called nudging, which of course most of you may have heard of, that can actually, that can help people do or make better decisions or decisions in their own best interests. So our responsibility is to use that data for to help people get better outcomes.
Happy to hear that, and I think quite confident in terms of coming from a leader in the South African market. Greg, your final thoughts and your takeaway as to how we move forward.
Yeah, just to build on that, we've spoken a lot today about the use of technology to help figure out consistently what the right answer is for someone. The thing I'm most excited about is using also technology to help us understand how best to communicate with people over the whole ups and downs of the investment journey. Building on what Paul said, I mean, we're working with clients to build what we call a nudge engine. So it's not just what's the right answer for you. It's markets were volatile last week. Your portfolio dropped. I know that you are a low composure, high impulsivity person. What is the message that I go to you with this week to really systematize and optimize the hand holding to help you retain the level of emotional comfort you need to stick in the market.
I love how we go back to the, again, configuration of data and people again coming together in terms of understanding that key relationship. Again, getting to know people, working on those relationships, starting with the person first versus the product, but most importantly, using the data, using the information to adequately drive and direct investors to their objectives and their goals in terms of their financial goals and objectives that they'd like to achieve, and not just following through with product as a leader to that particular element. Well, we'd like to thank you each for your contribution to this conversation today. Lots that you've given us to think about, lots that we'll continue to consider going forward. But most importantly, you've educated us as the South African masses to be cognizant of our own behaviors and how we respond in the time of a pandemic and the losses that can be incurred. And most importantly, to rework and establish the relationships we have with financial advisors as the key guides and professionals to lead us to the financial goals and objectives that we have. So big thank you to our panelists for joining us this morning, including Greg, all the way from London. We're appreciative of your time as well as the research you've shared with us. Paul as well, in terms of the presentation, and Warren and David for the insight that you've shared with us as industry representatives. We'd also like to thank you, our colleagues and members of the media, who have participated in this conversation and shared some of your questions, and majority of you absorbing the information as we look to share this with many members of South Africa and the global community. Well, we do want to remind you that you will also receive an email with a digital press pack, including a media release regarding today's conversation and some of the facts, figures, and more insight that you were privy to in this morning's virtual address. We also want to invite you that you will be able to see the images and the presentation slides of the speakers who addressed us this morning. Now, should you want to pursue an individual interview with any of the speakers that we've had here today, we would like you to kindly reach out to MSL, send them an email, and they will facilitate the interview arrangements that will take place. Well, we thank you for joining us today. We thank you for joining in the learnings and the insight that we've shared. And most importantly, trust that you walk away empowered, enlightened, and informed as you share this conversation with many members in South Africa and across the globe. Thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of Momentum Investments, do take care.